Here we are in our next module. We're going to be talking mostly about mental illness. So let's just dive right in. There's a lot to cover here. So far we've talked about um, personality styles, communication styles. We've talked about the needs of each person based on their personality or communication style. Now, what we're going to talk about are mental health challenges that can interfere with daily life. We're going to cover personality and mental health disorders. We're going to talk about their connection a little bit to stress and trauma. And then we're going to also kind of spill into how substance abuse can emerge as a coping strategy. So I want to just kind of harken back a little bit to this idea of personality styles. And we've talked about Maslow and what happens when the lower needs, like the physiological needs, the safety needs and the esteem needs kind of go unmet. We've talked about that a lot. We've tied that to emotional intelligence and how you can kind of get deregulated, like meaning that your emotional intelligence kind of tanks when you're under stress. The other thing that we really focused on as far as personality styles go was how people act under pressure, and then also talking about damping and motivation. So we were kind of looking through a lens of this is what you could expect under quote normal circumstances. And we know that normal isn't really normal and textbook isn't textbook. And so things happen. And you might start to notice that those personality traits that you're looking for tend to like get really exaggerated when someone is under stress or under strain. So what was really great, for instance, a mover really wants to have be free and make decisions in a split second, and they're fine to go forward with not as much maybe information or data as somebody else. But if that same person is under a great deal of stress, those kinds of traits can get really exaggerated, and then they kind of move from like the kind of like a healthy to a non-healthy spot on the spectrum. And so you're going to start to notice maybe as we go through some of these mental health topics that they might actually describe some of the traits that you saw as, good things. But what this is really talking about is like when things kind of are far too exaggerated or way different than the person's normal behavior. And when we're talking about mental health, and there's a lot of different factors that are associated with mental health. And mental health is shaped by both like your biological, like your predispositions, so like nature, versus nurture, the experiences that you've lived, the environments that you're in, the what you've been exposed to. So mental health does have an element of a very strong element of nature, like your chemical makeup, and then nurture. So when the vulnerabilities that we are born with kind of they might increase our risk, and then also environmental factors like your esteem needs are not being met, or you're so worried about putting food on the table, or anything that can you can imagine the list could be super long. So these all have an impact on first like what levels of stress that we're feeling, and then based on kind of your predispositions, those kind of stresses can turn from like normal stress into something that might become of a concern down the road. So there's so many factors that go into it. And again, we're not here to be therapists. We're not here to be able to diagnose when someone has mental illness. We're just going through to be heighten our awareness, number one, and then number two, be able to kind of just increase our radar a little bit and be able to maybe build a better sniffer to figure out if things are kind of going off and on. And so there's this model called I'm going to pronounce it wrong, diathesis stress model. And this is really talking about when a disorder, a mental disorder, is triggered by this combination of things, like where the equation then sets off and kind of passes the tolerance into a potential mental health issue. And so what this model is talking about is the combination of someone's predisposition, whether it's biological, genetic, psychological, plus the stress in their life. So the external influences that are going on. And then when you add those two things together, mix it up, you might very well find yourself or someone you love or someone that you're working with in a position where that can become exacerbated to the point that it might be considered a disorder of some kind. So let's dive in a little bit more to like these three factors. So environmental, biological, and psychological. So psychological factors can cause an internal cognitive, emotional, and development piece. They're all swirled together that impact how an individual thinks, then how they feel, then how they behave. These psychological factors could be attributed to early childhood neglect, possibly, or a loss, or they could involve a severe trauma like emotional or physical abuse, sexual abuse, or any kind of traumatizing incident. And I will say this, that sometimes being a witness to a traumatizing incident is enough. A lot of times when you are reading about mental health issues and trauma, we kind of infer that it's speaking about trauma that happened to you, but that's not really the only time that trauma comes into play. Being a witness or having someone that you know and love became, really hurt, those are all things that could classify as trauma. So don't always think of trauma as something that like an injury or an incident that happened to the individual personally. It could also be witnessed. So then the next piece in this stew are biological factors. And what we're talking about as far as biological causes of mental health issues could refer to like genetic makeup, your neurological makeup, so how your brain chemistry is working, the way that your axes and synapses are firing off, like the chemical pieces of that, physiological factors that influence brain function. And all of these things can increase susceptibility to mental health disorders. So we're talking a brain defect, like a physical, actual brain defect caused by either birth or injuries. There's heredity and genetics, prenatal damage. This is not all that uncommon when, as children are being born, that the mechanics of being born can cause some issues that they'll have to deal with for forever. Abnormal balance in brain chemicals, like I said, like the way your makeup is actually, your endocrine system is actually controlling the chemicals in your body, especially those in your brain, and then any other unusual brain development. So that's kind of just an idea of potential biological factors that can contribute to a predisposition to mental health issues. And then the third piece are environmental factors. So these are talking about anything external to you, your body or your mind, so external life experiences and conditions that might impact someone's mental well-being. So this could be exposure to toxins like chemicals, all the microplastics out there. Who knows what the effects of those are going to be. Nutrition has a lot to do with how well, and this kind of cause and effect, right? It does poor nutrition cause a difference in your body chemistry, your makeup, and so does your body respond chemically to different foods? Yes, we know that it does. So then does an environmental then transfer into a biological factor? Can be. Substance abuse, again, you could be around it, you could use it, or someone could use it, and those are going to cause things. Chronic stress, another great example of where an environmental factor, stress can start out as environmental and then it can turn into a biological factor. Poverty, anxiety, violence, social isolation, workplace pressures. By this time, I am sure you're starting to recognize Maslow in this. And so that is one of the big reasons why I wanted to start this class off really strong with Maslow, because all of these are like, you can tie all of these to Maslow pretty easily, and really talking about, those basic foundational needs being met, or being met meaning that you can then move up to higher and higher levels in the triangle. And if they're not met, then it gets harder and harder to self-regulate. So now we're going to really get into some of the mental health issues. So let's first do some vocabulary here. So, a mental health disorder, that is a term, a very general term, and it's trying to describe conditions that affect mood, thinking, or behavior. And if you kind of break those three words down, mood, thinking, and behavior, you can kind of see right there those are almost in sequence, right? So I'm in a bad mood, so I start having icky thoughts, and then I start behaving in an icky way. I they It kind of goes sequentially, and then you do a bad behavior, and then it continues to impact your mood, and then it continues further to impact your thinking more, and all of those things, and what all of that does to your body or your environment or whatever it is. Then those kind of, we can get more specific about that. But just in general, I just want to point out that when we're talking about mental health, it's a general term. And within the umbrella of mental health, you can have a mental health disorder that might be called an anxiety disorder or a personality disorder. And then there's a whole nother like chunk of, I don't know what they are. They're just disorders or patterns. So we're going to cover a few of these. But and by no means is this going to be an exhaustive list of all of the possible disorders that might fall under a mental health umbrella. But I picked out some of the ones that I think we might see most often in our day-to-day life. So anxiety disorders. So what are they? They involve intense fear or worry, and it causes your nervous system, because you are under intense fear or worry, it causes your nervous system to kind of go into overdrive. Anxiety disorders can be an ongoing thing, or they could be triggered by certain events. So, like PTSD, someone who's suffering from post-stress traumatic disorder could be just fine all the time, but then a sound sets them off. And so that's kind of the difference that they're trying to talk about here, is like it could be an ongoing kind of chronic condition that you're experiencing it at least a low level all the time, or there could be a triggering event that just shoots it up into your consciousness. um, Anxiety disorders are typically diagnosable medical conditions. They are medical conditions, and they the difference here from just a normal personality trait to a disorder is that it begins to disrupt daily functioning. That anxiety, that fear, that worry begins to impede your ability to function at norm, whatever that means, on a day-to-day basis. So there are a few of them that we're going to kind of get into a little bit more. One of them is general anxiety disorder, which is called GAD, panic disorder, social anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, so OCD, and then we'll talk a little bit about PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder. Personality disorders. So these are a little bit different. Personality disorders are long-term patterns of thinking. So it's not really fear and worry, although that it can be a long-term pattern of thinking, but these are related um, to like they're relating to and thinking and relating to situations that cause problems with work or relationships, and very importantly, emotional regulation. So that's another reason that we talked about emotional intelligence early on, was I wanted to make sure that we had a good foundation for what these kinds of things would look like in quote unquote normal, so that when something goes a little askew of normal, you can kind of see it and maybe pick it out. Um, these are not caused from momentary episodes of stress, like an anxiety disorder can be kicked off by that. Personality disorders are pretty deeply ingrained, and they are the filter by which you experience the world. So that those are kind of little distinctions. There are not really as many medical options for personality disorders. There are some, yes. And by the way, nothing that I say in this whole thing can be taken as black and white. There's always shades of gray in this entire conversation. So, some examples of personality disorders are borderline personality disorder, an antisocial personality disorder, and an avoidant personality disorder. And then what do we mean by other disorders and patterns? Well, these are things that just don't fit nicely into into the other two little boxes of anxiety disorders and personality disorders. But they are significant. They do impact and affect people's thinking and the way they feel and the way that they function. So, three examples of this kind of other category would be depression. And you can see, like, this is not a small, like, miscellaneous category. Depression is a huge deal. Bipolar disorder, and then how substance use and self-medication. So specifically in like that pattern section of this other box. Now here's some information to know. So mental illness as a general term is a wide range of brain disorders that affect, and I'm going to say it again because it's really important. These disorders affect a person's thoughts, moods, perceptions, how they remember things, like that's tied to perception, and their ability to focus as well. And surprisingly, mental illness affects 1 out of 4 people. So that's a little crazy if you think about it. 1 out of 4 people. Remember, mental illness, it can come and go. It's also on a spectrum, and there are shades of gray in all of it. So, saying 1 in 4 people doesn't mean that there's like a crisis situation with 1 in 4 people. It means that the people 1 in 4 people experience mental illness. And in all candor here, what this word affects, I really like to be very specific with definitions and understand what a word means, because words have meaning. So if someone were to say to me, affects people, then my very first question is, well, wait, does that number include the families that are involved with with people who have severe, like mental illness issues, or is it talking about the people who have the issue? I think I don't know the definition to that. I would say that mental illness impacts everyone around that person in some way. So maybe that's where that number is coming from, 1 in 4. I don't know. I wish I had better research for you. Maybe that will be the assignment, is tell Laura definitively if affects means the person who has the illness, or the people surrounding that person who has the illness. That would be a good bonus assignment. So let's talk about anxiety. So anxiety is definitely a normal reaction to stress. We all get anxious. It's kind of like that adrenaline gets pumping, and it can be a very good thing. It kind of keeps you on your toes. It's a natural reaction. We all need that. But when we're talking in the universe of mental illness, we're talking about excessive anxiety that brings on an irrational dread of everyday situations. That's when it becomes a disorder. It's not just that you're anxious, it's the irrational dread of something that's pretty normal, right? Just think of like agoraphobia, the fear of going outside. That's an anxiety disorder. And it's well, maybe in today's world it's not irrational to be afraid of going outside, but it's people who are agoraphobic cannot make themselves walk out the front door in some cases. In other cases, they can't leave their front yards, or they won't, whatever their situation is. So when we're talking anxiety disorders, that's the key definition to kind of keep in mind. It's excessive anxiety that causes an irrational dread of everyday situations. So, how do you know if someone is experiencing an anxiety disorder? Well, they can become pretty irritable, impatient, and they can panic really easily. Just some of the ways I like to think about this is as I read and study mental health very specifically, I'm often thinking about characters in movies or on TV, because characters in movies and on TV are very two-dimensional. There's not a whole lot of nuance to them. And so you can kind of start to pick up and associate characters in your mind to think about, okay, what character did I see on TV or in a movie that was completely irrational, impatient, and panic easily? And then I can remember that topic that I'm talking about. So they might worry excessively, exhibit physical symptoms. So the anxiety can cause a true physical response, whether it's a rapid heart rate, shortness of breath. Sometimes it's a stomach ache. Sometimes people will get like neck cramps or whatever it is. These symptoms can manifest themselves physically. It's not just all in your head or in their head. Um, Anxiety disorders are the most common illness, and out of the statistics show that out of all the mental illnesses, anxiety disorders um, affect like 18% of the people who do have mental illnesses. So it's the most common mental illness and anxiety disorder. 20% of Americans with anxiety disorders use drugs to help mask the feelings and to hopefully get some temporary relief. So we're going to talk about self-medication in another section. And this is all about self-medication is all about trying to remove yourself from the pain, get temporary relief, even if it's just to turn your brain off to go to sleep at night. Whatever it is, that's what the use of drugs or alcohol or whatever to help mask feelings means. Um, that's not always a terrible thing, but it becomes abuse. It becomes a bad thing when it's repeated over and over and over again. And then the condition can worsen. It can cause now biological factors as well. Um, Here's a statistic that's a little scary. People who experience mental health problems are more than 3 times more likely to have drug problems. So we said 1 in 4 people are affected by mental illness. And then those 1 in 4 people are more than 3 times likely to have drug problems. That's really scary. 6 out of 10 addicts now have at least one co-occurring mental disorder. So what that means is that there's for 6 out of 10 people who are addicts, there is also a mental disorder involved in that whole thing. And so when we talk about, the anxiety disorders, and then the propensity to then get into that hole of self-medicating and addiction. So you've got three factors that can go into play here. One is genetics, two is trauma, and three is self-medication. So when we're talking about genetics, we're talking about our genes as a blueprint for how our traits, our behaviors, how our brains are put together. And that, like we kind of talked about before, that can make someone more or less vulnerable to these situations. Trauma, as far as physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, are risk factors that can lead to later substance abuse. Again, trying to dull the pain. um, Trauma can be a single, like, bang event, like you get robbed or you get mugged, and then that causes anxiety. Trauma could be maybe you got injured in a car accident or on a job site. That could be like the bang trauma, or it can just be repeated over several years, and then all of a sudden it causes other issues. And one example to think about something that's happening over the course of years, think about Maslow and esteem. If someone's constantly being degraded or disrespected or told they're no good, that can start to cause a change in mood. And then that mood can start to change the way you think. You might start believing that. And then over time, it gets worse. Now you start acting like that. And so trauma we like to think about as being like a bang moment, but really it can be, what's that saying? Death by a thousand cuts. It can be like that. So it might not be like that one thing. It could be just slowly but surely over time. Your esteem just gets down, 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 further, 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 further. So that could be a big factor there. And then the thing about trauma, and I liked this kind of definition there, was that trauma occurs when the ability to cope is overwhelmed by the experience. So once your defenses are down to such a level that you can't, like, push back, your shell has broken, then that's when trauma is occurring. So something that might seem pretty small to me might be humongous to the person that's sitting next to me. Remember, we used that word perception before. And so if someone is predisposed to having a mental illness, they might perceive a very simple sentence in a completely different way than I do. And that perception can cause that to become trauma. And if over and over and over time that perception continues in that way, then that could be classified as trauma occurring repeatedly. And then self-medication. You're going to see this word chronic pain over and over in this, because I think this is one of the biggest things we forget about construction, is that people are working hard, or we're, either on the side or we're bent over our desks or whatever it is. And so chronic pain is a reality in our industry. And a lot of people uh, find themselves self-medicating to help deal with that pain. And many people with mental illness will have the mental illness pain, and then you add chronic pain on top of that, and so then that self-medication becomes more and more of a way of life. So specific anxiety disorders could be, I mentioned some of these at a high level, so now we're just going to describe them a little bit more. So generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. So this is a constant excessive worry about everything, constantly worrying about it. Even when there's nothing, not a darn thing to worry about, you're going to worry. Now, you might recognize this as one of the personality traits, right? Like, just like planners can find themselves really getting kind of sucked into this, and that's normal and that's fine until it becomes excessive and long term. and then can move from just a normal healthy behavior into something else. Thinkers could do this very easily too, all constantly like worried about the details, worried about being right, worried about being, the most confident, competent, smartest person in the room. That could be like move down that spectrum into a danger zone. Blues, I think blues can easily fall into this with the connectors, worrying about every single person around them to the point that then it becomes a problem. So some of these anxiety disorders are, like I said, they're just they're not just anything. They can manifest themselves as exaggerations of other traits. Panic disorder. So panic disorder are, and we've all heard about panic attacks. And so what this is talking about is these are repeated. A one-time panic attack does not an anxiety disorder make. We're talking repeated things over and over, and then that becomes a disorder. And so repeated unexpected panic attacks. So these can be described as like super intense surges of fear or discomfort, and it just gets you in the moment, like right, like sneaks up on you, and then all of a sudden your heart starts beating, you start to hyperventilate, you gotta leave. Some people will faint. Some people will their body temperature will rise a whole lot, and they just become very uncomfortable and cannot focus on anything other than getting out of the situation that they're in, and they'll just seize up. Um, yeah. Social anxiety disorder. So this connectors, well, this also thinkers and planners and movers. This is a deep fear of judgment. Remember, this is something that's anxiety disorders are things that become disabling. They create an irrational dread of everyday situations. So the high end on the spectrum here. So deep fear of judgment, rejection, or embarrassment. And this can happen in any place. It can happen within your family. It could happen within a professional environment. It could happen out with the bowling league. It could happen anywhere. Fishing off of the pier could happen anywhere. Um, it is the thing that prevents people from speaking up. They don't want to be thought of as stupid, or they don't want to be thought of as silly. They don't want to be thought of anything that would cause notice. I never suffered from social anxiety, but I can tell you I'm very tall. I'm almost 6 foot, and I used to hate walking into a room, even on time or late, because there I was, the tallest thing in the whole room. I would much rather be sitting down. Why? Because I didn't want people looking at me. That's why. And so that kind of thinking moved into like behaviors like I refuse to walk in a room late, or I refuse to stand up next to a little shorty short. That would be when kind of like that the kind of thinking and mood would move into a behavior that would indicate an actual social anxiety. But just pause and think about the times that maybe you didn't raise your hand. Think about daily huddles. People aren't participating sometimes. Why aren't they participating? Are they afraid they're going to get laughed at? Or are they afraid, they're going to be thought of as a silly response or question? That was a big one for me all the time. I hated asking questions in school because I didn't want anybody to think it was stupid for asking the question. All of that kind of anxiety is normal, but when it begins to impact your ability to actually function every day and it becomes irrational, like, well, maybe someone would say that wasn't irrational fear. Maybe I did suffer from social anxiety. I don't know. Now I'm starting to convince myself that I did. But you can, when it becomes an an impediment, is when this gets dangerous. And I really watch for this with my kids in high school too, to make sure that they've always been kind of challenged to live at the edge a little bit, but I'm always paying attention to make sure where their heads are, because this social anxiety is a real thing that happens to a lot of people. You can see why anxiety disorders are one of the most common kind of disorder, because we've all experienced something similar to these, but maybe not to the degree that they would be considered a disorder. Okay. Obsessive compulsive disorder, or as we all know and have heard it, OCD. So these are unwanted patterns of unwanted thoughts and repetitive behaviors or mental acts, so like compulsions that are done to reduce anxiety. And I'm going to really age myself here and talk about the show Monk, where Monk was a detective in San Francisco. He was real, I love this show, but he definitely was OCD. All the little things that he had to do. Oh, I'm going to date myself again. Everybody Loves Raymond. Robert Barone always would have to touch his chin before putting any food in his mouth, and it was like a running joke on the show. Robert, why do you always touch your food to your chin? That's an example of OCD. A lot of times, OCD is at the lower end of the spectrum. It's not uh, of a big concern, but it can very easily get higher and higher and higher to where it is debilitating. And watch Monk for an example. The first 3 or 4 episodes will completely describe that. Okay, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. This, I think, is a big one that we need to focus on, because this happens more often than we think. It is a mental health condition triggered by some terrifying event, and either experiencing it or witnessing it. And the symptoms can include flashbacks, nightmares, severe anxiety, and emotional detachment. If any of you have ever spent time with a veteran who is suffering from PTSD, you know exactly what this is. We have a friend, a very close friend, who lost both of his legs in Afghanistan. He was uh, driving down the road, and they ran over a bomb, and the car exploded, and all the people in the car were thrown from the car, and he lost both of his legs from the mid thigh down. And I was talking to his wife a couple of months ago, and she was telling me that the neighbor was installing a fence post, and the sound of the post being driven into the ground set off his PTSD and caused him to go and take cover and huddle under cover for several hours. He could not get up. He couldn't move. He was shaking. And for days afterwards, he was recovering from that experience, that reaction, that kind of, he heard the sound and it caused a major flashback. And I asked her how often that happened with him. And she said it's been about, I think, probably about maybe 18 years now, 20 years since the actual incident happened. And it used to be constant, like any loud sound would cause him to react very, very severely. But over the years, it's gotten less and less, but not less and less in frequency, but not less in intensity. So, what I mean by that is he doesn't necessarily react to every single sound like that, but when he does react, it is still very intense, and it takes several days to recover from that for him and the family, actually. So, PTSD and a psychological response. So, after an incident, let's just talk about that. So, it definitely, you can develop PTSD after being exposed to either a traumatic event or sometimes a potentially traumatic event. Like if you're involved in a near miss, either on a construction site or even driving down the road, that like level of anxiety, maybe the nightmares that you have after, or maybe you're driving more cautiously, or you won't go down a certain road anymore because whatever it is, it's something that's causing you to change your behavior because of that um, traumatic experience or potentially traumatic experience. Um, these events that can lead to people suffering from actual PTSD are some of them, not all of them, could be like being assaulted, um, being involved in a disaster of some kind, whether it's a natural disaster like a hurricane or a tornado or an earthquake, or a human caused disaster like being involved in a war, kind of as a civilian versus different than a soldier who's in combat. Those are two kind of different traumatic experiences. Accidents certainly can be a trigger for PTSD, and then other forms of violence as well. I lived in New York City about uh, starting about 7 years after the World Trade Center happened, and anytime that came up in conversation, you could see how people were still suffering. I had a very good friend of mine that had walked out of the building about 10 minutes before the plane hit. I believe she told me it was the second tower, and she still to this day has trouble walking anywhere near that area downtown, and she often thinks about like how close she was. So it didn't happen to her, but it was incredibly, as anybody, it would like the stories about the World Trade Center are just gut wrenching from the survivors. Okay, I'm going to move past that because it's exposure to events like this is common. About one half of all U.S. adults will experience at least one traumatic event in their lives, but most of those people do not develop PTSD. This is an extreme. This is a huge extreme. Remember, irrational fear that causes you, or anxiety, irrational worry, or fear that causes you to not be able to function in day to day situations. So it's more than just being scared or frightened, it's something that hampers your ability to perform. People who experience PTSD may have persistent, frightening thoughts and memories of the event. They keep reliving it over and over and over in their minds. That will cause sleep problems. One way of coping is that they'll start to feel like detached or numb or separate themselves from other people. Um, they could be easily startled. In severe forms, PTSD can impair a person's ability to function at work or at home or socially. So, if you just kind of think about this in the context of the personality styles, and this isn't exactly precise, but a thinker might begin to react to trauma, might become numb, and but then over focus on facts, like just really dig down into facts. And what they might need in a situation like this is a bit more time and space to be kind of thinking through stuff, kind of really processing those facts. A connector might become overwhelmed from the emotional pain that others are feeling. Really empathic are connectors. And so if they see someone going through something, they might attach to that and like empathically, and that can cause them to develop high levels of anxiety. So oh, nice spelling there. Connectors might need to actually be more time, spend more time with others who can provide them emotional validation. Movers, the movers might respond to trauma as in, I got to do something. I got to get out of here. I got to go run around the block. I got to go weed all the garden. Um, if someone you know who you suspect is a mover is just constantly, even more than normal after an incident or a trauma, and they are just constantly nonstop, that might be a sign that they're really suffering from that event, and they might need some help. They might need to be kind of just helped, whether it's talking to you or helping them find some assistance. And then a planner might actually respond to a traumatic event by kind of taking on the blame that it happened. Like, well, if I hadn't done this or that hadn't happened and then that hadn't happened, like the chain of events, that might be how a planner could possibly respond to a trauma. And now that's not to say that if we have an accident or a near miss on a job site, that we shouldn't be going in and looking at the entire process and managing all of the facts, looking through all of the facts and being sensitive to the emotional pain of others and doing something about it instead of just saying, oh, that's a darn tragedy, right? I mean, that's a good example of how all of these things, these personality traits are good, but when they're heightened and they to a point of exaggeration over sustained over time, when they can become an issue. So those were anxiety disorders. So now we're going to move into personality disorders. And so remember, these are long-term patterns of thinking, different than an anxiety disorder, and relating that cause problems with work or relationships. They're not really momentary episodes. They don't explode really big. They're a little bit different. So there's three major types of personality disorders. There's antisocial personality disorders, there are avoidant personality disorders, and then there are kind of borderline personality disorders. And there's a whole lot of layers in all of these, but the three main classifications are antisocial, avoidant, and borderline. So antisocial. So this personality disorder, typically they're characterized by showing a lack of remorse. They have no problems putting others at risk, and the antisocials don't see a problem with lying. That's not quite how their brain works. Avoidant um, personality disorders, on the other hand, are they manifest themselves in extreme shyness, sensitivity, or feelings of inadequacy. You can also start to see how some of these anxiety disorders and personality disorders can start to overlap. And if you've got both, they can really exaggerate each other. And this again is why we're not therapists here, to actually be able to make a distinction between the two, or to identify if there's one versus the other. Like that's not our aim here. And then borderline personality disorders these are pervasive, unstable moods, and they impact relationships and or behaviors. So antisocial personalities, let's talk about each one a little bit more. This disregard for others, the one term you'll hear a lot about antisocial behaviors is a sociopath. These people are very much like fall right in line with these things that we're talking about, and being and sociopaths fall on a spectrum as well. So they people who are antisocial will very often take dangerous risks, to themselves or to others. They can hurt others without remorse, but if you're talking to them about it, they'll show remorse, but they're not necessarily feeling it legitimately. Um, this isn't really being introverted or quiet. It's really constantly violating boundaries, rules, or the safety of others. And so, for anybody who has a teenager, you're probably right now thinking, oh my gosh, my teenager is antisocial. No, not necessarily. Although this does describe most teenagers, I think. The this is extreme and goes on all the time. This is a general way of thinking when it becomes a disorder. So an avoidant personality disorder looks super different. These people tend to be extremely shy and sensitive to criticism, and they're constantly afraid of rejection. They might isolate themselves, not because they don't care, but because they never feel they're going to be good enough. So once again, you can see this overlap between a personality disorder and an anxiety disorder. Like sometimes these are really hard to distinguish. Like the words are not all that different from each one, but the big difference comes in the general definition of each one, right? One is based on an event, and the other, the anxiety disorder, is usually has a catalyst to get it going. Usually, not always, but there's that kind of element of it. And then for a personality disorder, this is just kind of the way they operate, the way they think. And then borderline is often marked by intense emotions and unstable relationships. And this is interesting because someone with a borderline personality disorder could swing very quickly from like, this is the best person on the planet that I'm talking to all of a sudden they're the devil. It's the worst person I'm talking to. And we all know people who kind of behave in this way, not that they have a borderline personality disorder, but we all know people. What do we call it? We call it running hot and cold. They run really hot and really cold. You never know what you're going to get. Those kinds of behaviors that you're kind of thinking about as I'm talking about borderline personality disorders, those are examples that, but that doesn't mean that everybody who displays those characteristics has a borderline personality disorder. You're looking for I do think this is interesting, this idea that that swing from hot to cold can seem extreme, but are often rooted in a deep fear of abandonment and not feeling safe. Maslow, anyone? Right? So when we get to other disorders and patterns, we kind of see some things a little bit different. So these are things that just don't fall neatly into those two categories, the anxiety or personality disorder, but they are just as disruptive. They're just as painful, not just for the person experiencing it, but for the people around them who love them and want to care for them. And they are just as important to understand, even though we can't put a nice little label. These conditions, again, affect how a person thinks and feels and functions. They involve mood, potentially instability, this distorted perceptions. That is so important to be paying attention to. Is when you're talking to someone and you're practicing that active listening, if you're really kind of looking and paying attention, how askew is the person's perception on what's going on, and then having difficulty staying grounded in reality. So some of these are some big ones. Depression, so persistent sadness, hopelessness, loss of interest, withdrawal, and fatigue. Those are some characteristics of depression. There's bipolar disorder, and so this, like, in our social media, when somebody says bipolar, they mean like really big swings up and down, but they don't necessarily, you're not moving from seeing someone crying to someone laughing in 5 minutes. That they're a little bit different than that. They can look like that, but that's not necessarily what it means, that kind of mania. But the point with bipolar disorder is that there's a cycle, and someone's high swings are typically as high as their low swings are low, but there's this constant cycle that's happening. So it doesn't mean that they go always, everybody goes really, really high and really, really low. It can mean that they're just constantly cycling between this up and down of like greater or lesser amplitude. And then schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is characterized by altered thinking, delusions, sometimes hallucinations. If you ever saw A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe, well, I think all my movie references are old. He had schizophrenia and this disconnection from reality. And then substance abuse and self-medication. So the use of drugs or alcohol to manage symptoms of any of the above or any of the aside, right? The anxiety disorders and the personality disorders. So these can all be patterns or behaviors that either show an existing disorder or can show signs that things are kind of wiggling out of control. So depression, let's get into some of these in a little bit more detail. Depression is more than just feeling down. It is a deep, persistent loss of interest. Um, People can appear fine. You might never know that someone sitting next to you is depressed. This feeling of hopelessness, just constantly tired, withdrawn. Sometimes depression manifests itself in a completely different way. Sometimes people who are depressed just experience extreme anger all the time. Like they just anger from being put upon or, you know, disappointed all the time, and just a really like constant feeling like that. um you could have, thoughts of suicide. Not everyone who's depressed is suicidal. Not everyone who's suicidal is depressed. This is not like a causal relationship here. So you can have thoughts of suicide without being depressed, and vice versa. um Depression is unlike normal sadness, but what it does do to you is it can very much dull your sense of motivation. So it can disrupt your sleep. Like you can't get into a normal rhythm, healthy rhythm when you're depressed. I think that one of the important things that you could use to think about depression is this: making once enjoyable activities feel meaningless. That would be a great signal to you if you're worried about someone that you work with or in your family about depression, is sitting back and thinking, well, what did they maybe used to enjoy that now they don't? And um, is there a lot of that? And is it like very heightened? Like they used to like to do 20 different hobbies and now they do none. They might not be acting sad or, you know, having sleep problems, but they just don't want to do the things that they used to love doing. That can be a sign that something's going on. So, some symptoms: um, persistent sadness and low moods doesn't go away. That's a key part. That doesn't go away. We talked about activities that you once enjoyed. Always being really tired or low energy, even after you've slept. So, hours and hours and hours of sleep. Although this is a little bit of a slippery slope, because lack of activity breeds laziness too. So it's like, is it just that I'm just not getting out and building some lactic acid in my muscles and moving around? Or is it more? Is it different? Is it actual depression? And so being able to make that distinction, that is not for a layperson to really be able to say or diagnose. And sleep is an important indicator of a whole lot of mental and physical issues. So either one, right? Somebody who used to sleep a ton that can't sleep anymore, they're an insomniac. Somebody who never slept before is now oversleeping all the time. You really have to kind of be paying attention to changes, changes in appetite, difficulty concentrating or making decisions. And we all go through this. We're doing 50 bazillion million trillion things at once. If I'm having a difficult time making a decision today, does that mean I'm depressed? No. It means I got a lot going on, right? Um, Ongoing feelings of worthlessness, guilt, or self blame. This is a big sign here. Irritability, totally humongous sign. Restlessness, yes. Depression can manifest itself physically, constantly sore, constantly in pain. Now you add that to like chronic fatigue that you would be getting potentially on a job site, or, doing whatever you're doing. And so then what's the chicken or the egg here? I don't know. Social withdrawal, isolation. These things can lead to thoughts of suicide, and it's of a real concern if somebody's got an entire plan made out. That would be like a humongous warning bell going on. But suicidal thoughts are definitely a flag. If someone Here's the trick: if someone experiences several of these symptoms for more than 2 weeks and they interfere with daily functioning, that is probably time to raise a flag. So I'm just going to repeat again, more than 2 weeks, and they interfere with daily functioning. You might notice a pattern here that when we're talking disorders, they're repeated or they continue over a long period of time and they interfere with daily functions. That is a really important thing when you're looking at these and thinking about them. All right, bipolar, I already said, mood swings that go ups and downs, shifts. The shifts in the cycle are typically depression and mania. Although there's even a term here for what I said before, like the amplitude, right? How high is the high and how low is the low? Well, hypomania would be like kind of medium highs and medium lows, but they're still there. You're still going up and down. Um, well, when the person is down in a depressive episode, so the low, they're gonna show symptoms similar to depression versus the opposite in their manic times, with heightened energy. Someone who's not typically impulsive might become more impulsive at these times. And another trigger to be paying attention to is this invincibility. And remember, bipolar is talking about these changes. So one day they're, or 1 week or 1 month, they're like, oh no, I can't do anything. I'm not good at anything. I might get hurt or whatever. And then like a month later, you bring up the same topic and they're like, oh yeah, man, let's go. So it's changes like that. Um, Again, we've got sleep patterns to pay attention here. We've got body language to pay attention to here, talking rapidly, jumping from topic to topic, moving around, getting really antsy. I mean, if that person doesn't normally do that, then that's a sign. um, where uh, they might have that invincibility goes with like this inflated sense of self-esteem or these ideas of very grandiose, I am the king of the world today, and then tomorrow I'm the worst person on the planet. Like those are kind of examples of what you might witness. um, Unusual risks. And so examples, you could probably think of 1,000 examples on a job site where people can take unusual risks, like, oh, today I'm going to go and go up to the unfinished seal or roof with no tie offs, and I'm going to hang my legs down there and I'm going to jump around and do all those things. That would be a sign that something might very likely be off with that person. um, Acting impulsively without concern for consequences. So these are all changes. When we're talking mental health, we're talking changes to normal behavior over time that impede your ability to function. A person who has bipolar disorder, when they're in a manic state, they could be feeling super excited, productive, I've got everything done, and then all of a sudden in a low state, in that depressive state, they just can't do anything. They're not accomplishing anything or feeling like they're accomplishing anything, and that can go into any facet of life. There's also a level of fatigue during a low stage that can then just take the person lower and lower because they expended so much energy at the high stage. You're not just at the 2 points, you're not just at the highest point and the lowest point. There's a slope that goes down. So there are things that are happening along the way as you go ramp up and as you ramp down. So schizophrenia. So it affects approximately 1 in 100 people worldwide. And the statistic for that is a little bit lower for the US population. As you can see here, about 0.25% to about 0.64% of the US population suffers from schizophrenia. It is very much a spectrum disorder. Like all of these are spectrum disorders. It's not black and white. There's shades of gray in this whole conversation. Um, Interesting, I think Hollywood has done us a disservice, and everyone with a schizophrenia a disservice with some of the Hollywood stereotypes. Many people with schizophrenia live stable lives, um, especially with early intervention. They need quite a bit of support when they're having like um, an episode of heightened schizophrenia. I was interested to learn that schizophrenia typically develops in late adolescence to early adulthood. So I think this is important for us to be paying attention to in our industry, because if you think about it, we get and in a later lecture, I'm going to actually talk about the demographics in the construction industry in detail because of these kinds of conversations. So when you look at schizophrenia, someone between the ages of 16 and 30, there's a lot of people in our workforce between the ages of 16 and 30. And they may never have had a schizophrenic episode before. It may not have manifested itself at all before, but it could be something that's new. And so how can you maybe build your radar like I talked about? Well, hearing voices or seeing things that aren't there, hallucinations, holding false beliefs that aren't reality. So when we say, oh, you're delusional, what we're really saying is that what you're saying has nothing to do with reality. And I think that a lot more people than we think do have a belief that is not necessarily based in reality. Just think about this from a concept of our biases and our assumptions, and how well we listen or don't listen to what somebody's actually saying, how fast we go to snap judgments. Those are not schizophrenic behaviors. Those are kind of cognitive behaviors or thinking behaviors, the way that our brain works. But if that becomes an extreme for someone and they just cannot be shaken, and that can indicate a problem. Disorganized thinking or speech that's difficult to follow, um, difficulty concentrating and focusing on completing tasks, emotional flatness. So that's an important point, because those last two, disorganized thinking or speech, difficulty to follow, and difficulty to concentrate and focus, those are symptoms of ADHD, which are certainly not people who have schizophrenia necessarily. So this is like these examples. I'm just kind of highlighting some of these examples because I want to make it really clear that all we're trying to do here is become more aware, increase our awareness. This is also emotional awareness too, and recognizing that these kinds of disorders, these are not something that people can control right away without help. And so hopefully it makes us more kind to behaviors that we might be seeing. And then before we jump to a quick decision and be like, well, that guy's a jerk, or that woman is a, I'll leave that word alone. That there might be something else going on, at least at a low level, and then potentially at a higher level that we're just not aware of. Interesting factoid about people with schizophrenia, that they are more likely to be victims of violence rather than to commit it, to commit violence. And this is such a difficult to understand disorder, that there is a great stigma on it. Like when I grew up, it was not uncommon to call somebody a schizo, like a derogative remark, without any of us really understanding what we were talking about or thinking. And so if you're around anyone who is displaying multiple of these symptoms, then just try to be like super calm and respectful. Be very clear and slow in your communication, and just be paying attention to just keeping the vibe real mellow, and that will help that person, which sounds like good advice for anybody having a meltdown of any kind, if you ask me. All right, substance abuse and self-medication. So people who experience mental health problems are more than 3 times more likely to have drug problems. 6 out of 10 addicts have at least one co-occurring mental disorder. I know I repeated myself, and I had this at a different point in here, but this is so shocking to me, this statistic. 6 out of 10 addicts have at least one mental disorder going on at the same time. That's really nuts. And that really, like, if all you did was read that and go, holy crud, I gotta take myself off of the judge's bench and have a great deal more empathy. I really, when I saw this, I sat back and I thought, okay, 6 out of 10 addicts have at least one co-occurring mental disorder. Holy crud. That changes the whole thing for me in my bias and my filter about people who are struggling with substance abuse. So why do people use substances? So let's just talk about this. There's kind of three reasons why a person might become abusive towards substances, not just using alcohol or um, I guess drugs, but becoming abusive. So turns out that genetics play a part, trauma plays a part, and this need to self-medicate plays a part. So some people are simply more vulnerable. There could be a family history of addiction, and that could be because of the genetic makeup in the family. Um, that can also impact your predisposition to having a mental disorder. And so that plus a predisposition to having to substance abuse really is a recipe for disaster. Um, trauma. So trauma is when an experience overwhelms the nervous system, and so that can cause people to want to use substances. It is interesting that trauma actually changes the brain. I heard a long time ago, and I don't know how true this is, but someone said to me once, "Do you know why you remember times of when you got really hurt?" And I was like, "Yeah, in fact, I can remember a lot of times when I've been really hurt in my life, physically hurt." And it turns out that the chemicals your brain releases during trauma, like getting in an accident of some kind, actually burns the memory in a different place in your brain. And so if you think about that and you think about, oh my goodness, the like anxiety disorders, where if something happened like PTSD or something, so the trauma itself happened, it burned that memory into a different part of your brain, and you are consistently, continually reliving that same trauma, and it lives in a special part of your brain. Like that just changes the way of thinking of these things. Um, they're not People aren't trying to be dramatic all the time. Some people legitimately just that's where the chemistry is in their brain because of trauma. People who've experienced trauma may live in a constant state of fight or flight. That's PTSD is a good example of it. That wouldn't be the only example of it, but it would be a good example of it. They may seek out substances not to get high, but to quiet the noise. Interesting. I just can't turn my brain off. Oh, I'm so stressed out from the day on the site. I'm gonna go have a beer or a scotch or a Long Island or a Cape Cod and calm down the thinking so that I can rest, right? That could be where these things start. So quieting the noise. And then people who use alcohol or hard drugs or marijuana or other stimulants might just be trying to manage symptoms. And so many times that substance is trying to attempt to manage the mental illness, like people trying to drink to fall asleep or manage depression, chronic pain, dull the chronic pain. The medical industry is so different now than it used to be with giving out pain medication, that it could be that someone's trying to supplement the pain medication they've been given, and then that causes a longer term problem. So there's all kinds of reasons that people will start to use substances, and then that can move into abuse, particularly if there is a mental disorder involved as well. This is an interesting thing to think about. The fact that substance use doesn't happen in a vacuum. And this sentence really struck me. Behind nearly every addiction is a story. And often the story is one of suffering, unmet needs, like Maslow's needs, or an unrecognized mental illness. So when you see people struggling with substances and you think there's substance abuse going on or self medication going on, that's probably a symptom of a different root cause. And so again, we've got this swirl of cause and effect, chicken and egg. What is it? But if we're paying attention and we're watching body language and paying attention to changes in the people that we know, then we might be able to help them get help if they need it. But we're not diagnosing. So I wanted to give you some tools and resources for suicide prevention because this is a big problem in construction. In construction, the suicide rate for construction workers is 4.3 times higher than the national average. That's the US national average. So 4.3 times higher in construction than any other industry is our suicide rate. That equates to approximately 10 to 15 construction workers dying each day by suicide. So 10 to 15 of our construction brothers and sisters are killing themselves every day. That is a sobering statistic that we all need to pay attention to. Why does this happen? Well, construction workers face a different kind of set of challenges than other industries, and I would say it's kind of similar in high risk industries, but let's focus on construction here. So the the combination of stressors that we face in construction, they come from long hours and physically demanding work. We've got shifts sometimes that are going 12 hours a day, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week for months and months and months. That is a huge thing. I mean, I think anybody can put up with just about anything for a short amount of time, especially if they know when it's going to end. But boy, oh boy, you get these jobs that are just awful, and then they're going long term and they never seem to end, and you're working, you're working, you're working. So that's not unusual. That's not the norm, but it's not unusual. Financial instability and seasonal employment. This is a huge, huge deal for construction workers, particularly, not as much for people who are employed by like a CM firm or a GC firm or a specialty trade firm, and they're on staff with those kinds of firms, and on staff, like you're getting benefits and you're 40 hours a week, you have a regular paycheck, and it's not necessarily seasonal. But you move to especially parts of the country that have severe weather, one way or the other, like super extreme hot or super extreme cold, that seasonal employment becomes real, because there are just some tasks that you cannot do in the snow and the ice. And so the actual construction activity shortens up. I used to do I spent a lot of time in New England, and up in Boston, up in a town like a little bit north of Boston, for the winter months, we would do all of our training for the entire year between December and January, December, January, and February, because those were the coldest months. Those were the most hazardous months. Those were the months that work just wasn't happening. And so for a lot of the workers in the field who weren't employed by the company, they were on furlough and they were not getting paid for December, January, February. And by the way, that happened every single year. So that is a huge contributor to these stressors that happen in our industry. I've already talked about chronic pain and injury on more than once, but here it is. If you can't escape the pain, and pain, big pain, can become like an unwanted guest that never leaves and is always talking in your ear, is always keeping you up at night. It has a huge impact on family. If you're not able to go play basketball with your kids and you want to, but you can't because you're in so much pain. All of that really, really wears on people, and then you'll start to feel guilty that you're not participating in the way that you want to participate. And now the mood is moving, and the thoughts are moving, and now the behaviors are moving, and so it can move into other things. So chronic pain is a huge deal, and this is construction. People are in pain. Job site culture that discourages emotional expression. If we're always just sucking it up and getting over it, buttercup, then that is not a psychologically safe place to even start to letting out smaller um, vents of emotion or discussing it at smaller. Um, we've all heard about, the machismo attitude in our industry, and how it's not cool to have problems or issues and just don't talk about it, and to work through the pain. The and a lot of people who are in construction, they're veterans and they've seen combat, and they come into the construction industry afterwards. There's pain there from, injuries. Many people are carrying a lot of pain from what it takes to be a soldier. A lot of people in construction were athletes in high school, and maybe in college, and so pain from injuries as an athlete can become worse and worse and worse over time. So these things change, and they can severely impact your mental well-being. And if you can't complain about, like, oh, I hurt, without being told to stop being a wuss, then it can get more and more difficult. Easy access. So construction has a lot of things that you can do self-harm with. I heard a terrible story about a worker who came in. They were in a glass plant doing renovations in a glass production plant, and this man one day just walked off the mezzanine into a vat of glass. No one saw it coming. um it was there. Would he have found another way of doing it? Maybe, but it was pretty easy to do it, like, physically, with things that were there. Not that it was easy to do that, but that's an example of easy access to lethal means. Um, Even just the skin of a building, is the building enclosed? It could be it's easy to, not easy. These words talking about this are so difficult because they could be taken in the wrong way. But just just trying to describe how it might not be a gun or drugs that someone uses to kill themselves with. It could be just walking off the edge of a building. Someone in the wrong place at the wrong time mentally could see that edge of the building. Um, Actually know someone who did this. I'd see the edge of the building and just decide that they were going to just walk all the way off of the building. So that is a real factor in suicide in construction, is the accessibility of lethal means. Okay. So now I wanted to share with you some things that came from the National Institute of Mental Health. All of these are in the notes that are going to be attached for the lecture. So you can have these. They're actually designed to be posters, and the website is there for you to be able to get them. So, warning signs of suicide. So some of these may be a signal that someone might be thinking about suicide. So if someone starts talking about wanting to die, expressing great guilt or shame, and being a burden to others repeatedly, that those could be signals. Another one is someone expressing, or you personally feeling hopeless or trapped, no reason to live. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose, right? What's my purpose in life? I have no reason to live. Extremely sad, or more anxious or agitated. Um, Having unbearable emotional or physical pain. Remember that depression can cause physical pain. Some of these anxiety disorders can cause physical pain, and some of these psychological disorders or personality disorders can also cause physical pain. So it's not just pain from an injury, but it can be manifested physically. Changing behavior. So making a plan or researching ways to die, withdrawing from friends, starting the to say goodbye. That would be something to pay attention to, and the way that they're saying goodbye. Giving away important items is a big indicator. Making a will, I guess that depends on context, but these other things they're separating from daily life and clo- addressing what they might see as loose threads, things that have to be done before they go. Um, Taking dangerous risks could be mood swings, extreme mood swings, eating or sleeping less, and using drugs or alcohol more. So those would be warning signs that someone might be thinking of suicide. And please note that these have all crisis hotline numbers on them. So if you wanted to print these out from your handout or go directly to the website to use them in your workplace or whatever, please do so. Just start making it normal to talk about this stuff. All right. Here's another tool. 5 action steps to help someone having thoughts of suicide. So, first of all, you could ask someone, are you thinking about suicide? Do you have a plan? It's not an easy question to ask, but sometimes just asking the question can open the door and help someone begin to talk about it. That's interesting. I had some videos that I wanted to share, but I thought that you guys would be sick of listening to me talk how long this thing is. But studies show that asking people if they are suicidal doesn't increase suicidal behaviors or thoughts, which is an interesting thing to know. Like this idea, I don't want to give them the idea that studies show that that's not necessarily a concern. Number 2, be there. So listening without judgment. This is big active listening kind of time, right? Being more of an ear, give them the space to speak all the way through. We went through active listening in the previous module, but being there physically, mentally, emotionally for the person. Um, Help keep them safe. So if things are escalating, then you might want to be thinking about removing lethal items. You might want to observe how close, like if you were on a site, how close is that person wanting to come to the edge of the building? I mean, hopefully there's protection in place and tying off, but how often are they kind of pushing that edge? And what's their attitude and behavior when they're doing it? That might be an indicator. Um, Help them connect. Just because you might not be able to help them, but you notice something might be off or you think it might be off, help them reach out, maybe connect them to an employee assistance program that the company has, a EAPS, or maybe talk to a different friend, or maybe help them find a counselor, or going even to just your primary care physician and having a conversation with that physician can help address issues before they go too far. And then following up, that would be the 5th step, is stay in touch with the person after they've experienced a crisis or they've been discharged from care. Like don't be afraid to follow up with someone who may have had an episode. If you don't follow up with them, then that could build a feeling of isolation. So you might feel awkward, like, what do I say? I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. Well, listening and sitting just elbow to elbow could be the very thing that person needs. Just breathing the same air, it could be the very thing that person needs. And that if everybody shies away from someone who had an event like that, then aren't they more isolated even than they maybe were before? I don't know. So just ways to maybe think about and challenge our initial kind of human reaction to that. Okay. Here's another resource that I thought was very good to go over. So How do you assess whether or not you need help or if you're thinking about someone else? So I said it multiple times about the 2 weeks. So have you had mild symptoms for less than 2 weeks? Then um, maybe try to do some more exercise, get some more time with the people that you love, finish off some of those things that are all still open and just pick them one at a time and try to finish them off, right? Maybe meditation or exercising or watercoloring or go into your shop and work on your lathe and turn another bowl or go fishing or whatever. Find some low stress activities that you like to do and go do it. Make time to do it. And I know we're so busy, but even if we can carve out 5 or 10 minutes to go and do something that we really enjoy doing, that can go a long way. Even taking a 5 minute walk outside improves your mood. Interesting little piece of information. Just a 5 minute walk outside can be a mood enhancer. If you've had symptoms that you would classify as severe, you and you know the people around for more than 2 weeks. So sad, tearful, hopeless, irritable, frustrated, worthless, guilty, all of those symptoms that I went over. If you've had those symptoms for more than 2 weeks, then it's time to probably seek some professional help. um, 2 weeks. Again, not black and white, rule of thumb. If you're having, or someone you know, or is having immediate thoughts of suicide, you can call a crisis hotline by texting 988 suicide. There is 988lifeline.org, and I'm going to show you a whole bunch of other resources as well in just 1 second. So here we go. So there's a lot of resources that are available. First of all, the Clemson University has the CAPS, which is their counseling and psychological services. They've got a phone line that's open 24 hours. You can get individual therapy, you can get crisis intervention. They put on workshops, they'll give referrals. Um, and so you can go there as a Clemson student. They're located in the Redfern Health Center. I've got their website on there. There's a 24-hour support line. And definitely, though, in any life-threatening situation, you got to call 911 and go to the nearest hospital, whether it's life-threatening for you or someone that you think is in a life-threatening situation. This whole sheet is in the handout as well. Um, if you have an employer that has an employee assistance program, what do those typically mean? They are usually like these third party programs that provide free and confidential counseling that your company pays for. Uh, there's usually mental health assistance, grief counseling. Grief, I wanted to talk about grief, but we just don't have time for it in this lecture. But grief counseling can be an incredibly important thing, and grief can be one of those influencers in attitude and mood and behavior. So never underestimate the power of grief. Um, Workplace stress. Usually, you'll see signage, at least I have in the organizations I've worked for, there's signage all over the place for how to contact the EAP program. And if you don't see signage, it's going to be with your HR person, or it's going to be in your onboarding manual that's usually covered there. Um, yeah. And then I've listed a whole bunch of websites here that are available at a national level, and what you might use them for. So we've got the Veterans Crisis Hotline right there for military vets. The National Center on Domestic Violence and Trauma. Their contact is right there. There's Alcoholics Anonymous, the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention, uh, mental health counselors, mental well-being, mental recovery. There's the contact for Military One Source and the Wounded Warrior Project. So there's a whole bunch of of places and people that a person could contact if they needed any kind of counseling at all. And then in addition to all these national opportunities and then also the Clemson opportunities, there are always local opportunities as well. So, but you can't take advantage of an opportunity if you don't know if it exists. So, at minimum, everybody now should be like, okay, I know there's help out there. I just got to be able to find it when I need it. And so, having it at your fingertips is great. I suggest that for anybody who doesn't, I put Clemson on here because well, I'm assuming that we're all Clemson students that we live in Clemson and have access to campus. But I would suggest that the very first thing that you do is to find your local resource and get that phone number. In fact, that's going to be the one and only assignment for this whole lecture is to submit a local resource with contact information. Not any of these that I gave you, but a local resource within your community. That's going to be the homework assignment. And that's going to be the only homework assignment. Okay, well, this does no good with me blocking it. So, um, there's a lot of different treatments that are available. I mentioned primary care providers. I showed a bunch of federal resources. And so I think that we've covered that plenty. All right, so that concludes this module, this lecture, and I I hope that that you learned something and that it was interesting and that you might feel a little bit more um, exposed to things to potentially listen to. What on the topic of listening and active listening, when you're reading and you're doing more listening than talking, these kinds of symptoms may be going through your mind. They're almost you could almost say that you're listening for those. Like has the personality traits under stress, have they kind of moved into an extreme? Am I seeing extreme behavior over a long period of time? Am I being empathetic and listening in a way that says there might be something going on here that I'm not necessarily aware of. That takes me back to like the grief conversation as well. Like when people are grieving, um, the behavior changes and feelings change. There, I read an article today, as a matter of fact, where there were neuroscientists who had done a study on the difference between brain activity when people are around their own children and their pets. And it was crazy that that actually brain activity is very similar. So even if you know someone who had a pet recently die, we really feel silly grieving over our pets, but it's real. And even something like that is something to be aware of and listen for and be empathetic to because those people are going through a lot of stuff. So on that note, I'm going to conclude this lecture. I'll see you next week. And next week, we're going to get into construction demographics. So have a great, and don't forget the homework. I'm going to set that homework up right now. Local resources for mental health and well-being help.